It's time to talk about rebadges again. In a previous video, we discussed 5 Honda branded vehicles that aren't actually Hondas at all. Some of them straight up rebadges, some of them Honda packaging wrapped around someone else's powertrain. This is not a Honda.
How dare you?
Today we're going to do just the opposite. Today we're going to look at 5 vehicles that aren't branded Honda or Acura, but are either using Honda powertrains or are just straight up Hondas in disguise. Some more thinly disguised than others. Let's kick things off with the first generation Saturn Vue. Now, Saturn was a subsidiary of General Motors, originally intended to compete with Japanese imports, and operated for most of the company's short lifespan at least, independently of other GM brands with its own dealer network.
So if I buy this Saturn Vue, you'll give me that offer right now?
Yeah, right now.
Okay, when you say right now, you mean...
This very moment.
The Saturn Vue, Saturn's first SUV, went on sale in 2002 and was built on GM's new at the time Theta platform, along with the Chevrolet Equinox and the Pontiac Torrent. Initially, there were 2 engine options: GM's 2.2-liter inline-4 Ecotec engine, known as the L61, or the V6 option, GM's 3-liter L81 engine, which was shared with the Saturn L Series, the Saab 9000, a couple of Opel models, and the Cadillac Catera. However, for the 2004 model year, the V6 engine was changed. GM's L81 engine was dropped and a new 3.5-liter V6 engine was dropped in. While internally designated the L66 engine at GM, it was actually a Honda J-Series engine, the J35S1, which was an adapted version of the J35A5 found in first-generation Acura MDXs, and made about 250 horsepower, nearly a 75 horsepower jump from the power output of GM's L81 V6 used the previous year. While the powertrain on the V6 Saturn Vue was 100% Honda, the body, chassis, and interior was all GM. So let's talk about the Saturn Vue's styling. Well, the exterior design is, well, I'm sure it has a great personality. The long horizontal headlight assemblies are very Saturn, but the rest is pretty generic early 2000s GM. The interior was also very generic early 2000s domestic. The 90s and early 2000s was not a great time for domestic car interiors. With their excessive use of cheap plastic and rounded edges, these were sometimes called the Fisher-Price era of interiors. I think Saturns had already lost a lot of their uniqueness by the early 2000s thanks to GM corporate interference and cost cutting. Also for 2004, a high-performance trim was introduced called the Redline trim. The Redline used the same J-Series V6, but it had a unique suspension that lowered the body by 1 inch, added 18-inch alloy wheels, and had redesigned body-colored bumpers. The interior was upgraded with white face gauges, a different steering wheel, and there was either suede or optional heated leather seats. 2006 was the mid-model refresh. The Vue got a new front end, both for the regular and Redline models. All trim levels now had body-colored rear bumpers, and the interior was redesigned, and I think it looks much better. 2007 was the last model year for the Saturn Vue. There was a second generation, but they no longer used the Honda V6, so their relevance to this video ends. It might be surprising or seem a little strange to learn that for a few years, a GM product was leaving showrooms with Honda's well-known J-Series V6, like the one they use in everything. But as we know now, it wouldn't be the last time these two companies would exchange powertrains.
We're also excited about our new Vue Redline with 250 horsepower and 18-inch alloy wheels. Why not test drive them both?
Buckle up for safety.
If you watched the first rebadge video, you'll remember that Honda rebadged 2 Isuzu models in the 90s to be sold as their first 2 SUVs. The Isuzu Rodeo, which became the first and second generation Honda Passports, and the Isuzu Trooper, which became the Acura SLX. As part of the deal, Isuzu was given several Honda models to rebadge, and the first one we'll talk about is the Isuzu Aska. The Isuzu Aska is kind of a funny car. Throughout its 5 generations, it's been 3 completely different vehicles. The first generation was built on GM's J-body platform, with its closest local relative probably being the first generation Chevrolet Cavalier. The Aska had its own unique styling though. Anyone else getting Renault Alliance vibes from the front end? In the early 1990s, Isuzu stopped producing their own passenger cars, and second generation Isuzu Askas were rebadged Subaru Legacies, but then third and fourth generations would become rebadged Accords as a result of Isuzu's new deal with Honda. Third generation Askas were designated by the Isuzu model code CJ1, and CJ1s were pretty much just straight up Accord rebadges, with no cosmetic differences aside from a different grille and logos. Unlike Accords though, they were sedan only, only. There was no wagon or coupe option. And also, unlike Accords, there was only one engine option, a 2-liter F-Series. Now don't get too excited, it's not the dual overhead cam F20B from SIR Accords, it's the single overhead cam 2-liter F-Series, which you also would have found in certain Japanese Accord trims. Both 5-speed manual and 4-speed automatic versions of the Isuzu Aska were offered. For 1998, the Accord was redesigned and entered its 6th generation. So, as expected, the Aska enters its 4th generation. This Aska may look a little more different from our 6th gen Accords, with slightly different shaped taillights and a different looking interior, but logos, grille, and wheels aside, it's still a straight rebadge of Japanese 6th gen Accords. Japanese 6th gen Accords are just a little bit different than American Accords, with slightly different lights and a different interior that is actually the interior that 2nd gen TLs are based off of. It is funny though how much that slightly different Isuzu grille does give the Aska a bit of a different look, even compared to the JDM Accords. For 1998, the Aska now had 2 engine options, one of them another 2-liter F-Series, this time with VTEC making 148 horsepower, or for buyers that wanted to avoid that Japanese 2-liter engine tax, there was now a 1.8-liter option available. These Aska models were designated as CJ2 for the 1.8-liter and CJ3 for the 2-liter. The last Isuzu Askas were sold in September of 2002, and they marked the end of passenger car sales for Isuzu.
Today's Chevrolet is a little import called Spectrum, a spectacular combination of fun and practicality. We call it
Spectrumality. Solid. Spectrumality.
price.
Spectrumality. Room.
Isuzu Geminis originally started out in the mid-70s on GM's T-Car platform, and later on the R-Body platform. 2nd generation Geminis made their way to the North American market to be sold as Chevrolet and Geo Spectrums, and there was also a Pontiac version sold in Canada called the Pontiac Sunburst. 3rd generation Gemini coupes were sold in Canada and the US as the Isuzu Impulse and Geo Storm. The 4th generation Gemini came out in 1993, and again as a result of Isuzu's new deal with Honda and Isuzu's corporate decision to stop producing their own passenger cars, the Gemini became a rebadged Honda. You might not recognize this body style if you're from North America like me. It's a direct rebadge of the 1st generation Honda Domani, which is built on the 5th generation Civic platform. The Domani was Japan's more upscaled version of the Civic. We can see some of the more upscale Domani interior features in these pictures, which included faux wood grain and automatic climate control. It even appears to have keyless entry. And what's this? 4-wheel drive? Okay, I'm getting sidetracked. Getting back to the Gemini, it's pretty much a straightforward rebadge with once again logos and grille being about the only differences, but it is much more basic. There's no 4-wheel drive version, and while the Domani had a few different engine options including a B series, okay, why aren't people importing these? The 2 engine choices that the Gemini got were Honda's lean burn D15B economy VTEC engine, similar to what you would find in a 5th gen Civic VX, or the 1.6-liter single overhead cam VTEC ZC engine, which was also in the Domani. This was a JDM Civic engine option, and despite its weird name, it's just a D16 variant, and it's most similar to the D16 Z6, which is the North American 5th generation Civic Si engine. I read that Isuzu never really marketed the 4th generation Gemini, and they essentially just tried to sell it to their existing commercial customers. So maybe this explains why Isuzu's passenger car division failed. It's unfortunate though, because Isuzu of America had some of the best car commercials ever.
I brought my family to tell you about it.
It's so roomy. I use it to deliver pianos in my spare time.
It looks neat, so it's great for picking up chicks.
In 1997, the Gemini entered its 5th generation, coinciding with the 2nd generation Domani, which was now based on the 6th gen Civic platform. More specifically, the 2nd generation Domani is a rebadged version of the Canadian market Acura 1.6 EL, which if you don't know, it's Canada's fancy Acura version of the Civic. And if you're not familiar with them yet, don't worry, I've got you covered. I've already done a video on them. Acura 1.6 ELs were actually built in Canada, and the respective Domani and Gemini versions were then exported back to Japan. The Acuras were a little more upscale in some ways with optional leather interior and heated seats, but Domani owners, depending on trim, could get an early version of a Honda navigation system. Gemini owners would have to settle for a tape deck, but you could still get auto climate control. Domanis had a few different engine choices again, including a 4-wheel drive version, which makes me really want to build a B-series powered 4-wheel drive EL now. Gemini engines were again a 1.5 liter, but I'm not sure on the exact version if it's the same as last year. I'm assuming it's whatever this engine is. It's very hard to find information on these. And then there was a 1.6 liter option, which was the D16A, a 1.6 liter VTEC that was similar to the D16Y8 found in Civics and ELs over on our side of the pond. One interesting thing about the Gemini is there's a very slight cosmetic difference this time aside from the logos and grille. ELs and Domanis use outer taillights with clear turn signals, but the Gemini puts back the amber turn signals, the same outer taillight that the Civic sedan uses. So it essentially looks like somebody took their 6th generation pre-refreshed Civic sedan and slapped an EL or Domani trunk lid on it. Coinciding with the end of the 6th generation Civic, 2000 would be the last year for both Domanis and Geminis because nobody wanted to build anything on that trash 7th gen Civic platform. Okay, fine, I guess the real reason was that Isuzu was now pulling out of the passenger car market altogether. And the Domani was replaced by the Honda Fit Aria. I don't know, it's also called the Honda City.
12:42 p.m. entering Toyota dealership.
Hi. Hey, you're Joey Isuzu. Hey guys, it's Joey Isuzu.
My kids love you. Come on, what's the real difference between your Corolla and my iMark?
For starters, the Corolla's about $1,000 more.
Oh, what a feeling!
Joe, you're not going to use that in the commercial, are you?
Oh, no!
In the late 70s, British Leyland, which would later become Rover Auto Group, was looking to develop a new small family saloon to replace the aging Triumph Dolomite.
I don't, understand. Some of the words a little too sophisticated for you.
A saloon is the British term for sedan. Anyway, at the end of 1979, British Leyland signed a perhaps unexpected collaboration deal with Honda, which would see the new Triumph essentially become a licensed rebadge of the Honda Ballad. The Honda Ballad, for those that don't know, was an upscaled 2nd generation Honda Civic. As part of the agreement, the Ballad would not be sold in Europe, and instead British Leyland would assemble the Acclaim at the pressed steel Fisher plant in Cowley, Oxford, with all of the major parts and components imported from Honda's factories in Japan. The amount of British sourced components would gradually increase over the Acclaim's production life. The new Triumph Acclaim officially went on sale for the 1981 model year and ended up being very successful for British Leyland. In fact, in stark contrast to the previous models, the Acclaim held the record for the lowest percentage of warranty claims on a British Leyland car. Almost like it wasn't really their product. A good reminder to everyone that if you can't make a good product yourself, you can always license someone else's. Compared to the Civic, you'll notice some differences. The taillights are different and the interior has a pretty different dashboard and gauge cluster. But that's because, like I said, the Acclaim is not a rebadged Civic, it's a rebadged Ballad. And compared to the Ballad, the interior and exterior is almost identical. The Ballad is more upscaled from the Civic, and the Acclaim is even a little more upscaled from the Ballad. And this is reflected by a more upscale and well-equipped interior. There were chrome trimmings on the doors, a 2-color dash, and seats that were far more comfortable than anything you would find in a Civic or even a Ballad. And I like the Ballad and Acclaim gauge cluster better than the Civic version. It has a unique layout and little decorative trim rings around the speedo and standard tachometer. All models feature a mechanical clock, at least I think that's what these old school clocks were called. You know, the ones that had dials that rotated, or sometimes they were flaps that flipped down? I call them Groundhog's Day clocks.
Then put your little hand in mine.
The Acclaim came in the usual British Leyland trim levels, L, HL, HLS, and the top of the line CD. The top model had power windows, chrome bumper trim, and even headlight washers. Under the bonnet was Honda's EN4 engine, a 1.3 liter single overhead cam, 8-valve engine with a twin carb setup which made about 70 horsepower. Transmission was a choice of a 3-speed auto or 5-speed manual. The normal Honda badged rocker cover was replaced with a plain one to make it a little less obvious to the teacher that you were handing in someone else's work. No, I didn't copy my friend's test answers, I'm just licensing his work. But to be fair, Triumph did source more local parts for the Acclaim than your typical rebadge.
No.
Including locally sourced drive shafts, radiators, seats, fabrics, glass, and carpeting. Even the frame and body panels were molded and welded with British steel and painted in British paint shops. Because of Triumph's investment into the Acclaim's manufacturing process and the fact that it is constructed out of British steel, the Acclaim was not classed as a Japanese car, allowing it to be imported into other European countries such as France and Italy, which had imposed limits on the imports of Japanese cars. And this simple fact explains a lot of what Honda's motivation was to enter this co-production agreement with British Leyland. Essentially, Honda cars, when assembled in Europe with enough European materials, were able to get around Japanese market share limits that had been imposed by several European countries. The Acclaim was refreshed in 1983 with minor interior changes that included updating the Groundhog's Day clock to a digital one. There was also a very limited edition Avon Acclaim, which was upgraded by Avon coach builders of Warwick. The upgraded coach of the Avon Acclaim featured leathered seats with colored piping that matched the exterior. The dashboard received a slab of walnut wood trim which extended onto the doors, and there was thicker carpeting and added soundproof not only to the interior but to the bonnet and boot as well, drastically reducing noise levels in the cabin.
I used a thesaurus.
The exterior was upgraded with two-tone paintwork, a vinyl roof, colored wheels with chrome trim, and a chrome grille. It all really does give the Avon Acclaim a pretty different look from the standard Acclaim. Launched in 1982 at the Birmingham Motor Show, Avon initially intended to produce up to 25 Avon Acclaims per week, but while official production numbers are not known, it is estimated that the actual number never surpassed 10. But if an Avon Acclaim still isn't rare enough for you, there was also an Avon Turbo Acclaim. Avon Turbo Acclaims were outfitted with a Garrett Type 3 turbocharger which boosted engine power from 70 to 105 horsepower, and mid-range torque from 74 pound-feet to 123 pound-feet at 3,500 RPM. Further placebo horsepower was added through large turbo lettering added to each side of the vehicle. I drive a turbo and I want you to know. 0 to 60 times were slashed from 11.9 seconds to 9 seconds flat. How many turbo Avon Acclaims were made is not publicly known, but some sources speculate that there are as few as 4 turbo Acclaims left in existence, original press car included. By the 1980s, both Honda and British Leyland were in need of a full-size executive car for their lineup. British Leyland needed to replace the aging Rover SD1, and Honda didn't really yet have a full-size executive car. Honda was planning to soon launch Acura as the first Japanese luxury brand into the North American market, and a rebadged Accord simply wouldn't cut it. So building on their previous collaboration and success of the Triumph Acclaim, joint development on a new full-size executive car platform for both brands began in 1981. For Honda, this resulted in the first generation Acura Legend. For British Leyland, it was the Rover 800 series. Both cars would share the same core structure and frame, but each brand would make their own unique interior and exterior. Honda supplied the chassis design, automatic and manual transmissions, and the V6 engine, while British Leyland supplied much of the electrical systems and the 4-cylinder engine. While Rovers were available in both 4-cylinder and V6 options, Honda exclusively used their own V6 on the Legend and wisely used mostly their own electrical system as well. Now you might think that this would mean that, like the Triumph Acclaim, the Rovers, the V6 ones at least, would be pretty reliable cars thanks to that Japanese powertrain. Unfortunately though, that wasn't the case, because the electronics on the Rovers and just about anything else that Austin Rover, formerly British Leyland, touched was typical British build quality. And nowhere is this better documented than in a January 1987 issue of Automobile magazine. Journalists from Automobile magazine ordered a 1986 Rover 825 and put it to a long-term test, and documented all of the things they had to take back to the dealer to be fixed over the course of that test. I'm going to start a counter in the corner of the video, and every time it hits a mileage that automobile journalists had to take it back to the dealership for repairs, I'm going to interrupt myself and tell you what they report broke at that mileage. Exterior styling on the Rover 800 is very different from the Legend. It definitely looks very European, and it's nice enough, but I prefer the look of the Legend myself. Since we're focusing on rebadged Hondas for this video, we're mainly going to look at the V6 Rovers, designated as Rover 825s and equipped with Honda's C25A engine, a single overhead cam 2.5 liter fuel injected V6. Starting in 1987, Honda upgraded the engine to a 2.7 liter, and V6 Rover models now became designated as Rover 827s. Notice how, like in every other rebadge we've covered so far, they remove the Honda branding from the valve covers, like that's gonna fool anyone. Also, we already need to stop, because at just 2,321 miles, Automobile's Sterling 825 already had a broken fuel gauge, a sticky glove box, an off-center steering wheel, an inoperative cruise control, door molding fitment issues, a coolant warning light flashing, and out-of-balance tires. Now the interior is really different from the Legend interior. I love the Legend interior, but I have to admit the Rover interior is pretty luxurious too, with wood grain trim, thick leather, and a very European design that is very different from what I'm used to seeing here in North America. It's a little bit more complicated with lots of buttons and switches, and some switches have icons that I assume are standard in Europe, but as a simple Canadian, I don't know what these two icons mean. One is obviously something to do with the seats, the other is, I don't know, I'm going under a bridge button. Someone tell me in the comments. Oh, and at 3,751 miles, the windshield started leaking and the fuel gauge was reading inaccurate. Initially, the Rover interior had a full complement of analog gauges, complete with a voltmeter and oil pressure gauge. You won't find that in the Honda version. But an interior update in 1990 changed the gauge cluster to a much simpler, almost Honda-looking design, and the voltmeter and oil pressure gauges were removed. Apparently, though, it wasn't cost-cutting, which was my initial assumption, but actually the result of a change in supplier for the gauges, which was meant to improve their reliability since there had initially been some issues. By the way, at 6,544 miles, the sunroof and windshield washers stopped working. Some Rover 825s and 827s were sold in America as well, but they were branded as Sterlings. At 7,004 miles, the passenger lumbar support broke, the trunk trim came loose, and the fuel gauge read incorrectly again. Initially, the Sterlings sold well in North America, but oh, are you kidding? Okay, at 7,609 miles, the driver's seat adjustment stopped working. Initially, the Sterling 825 sold well alongside the Legend, but unfortunately, early build quality issues plagued the Sterling. At 8,886 miles, the coolant and fuel gauge stopped working, the driver's seat lumbar support broke, the brake warning light stuck on, the passenger seatbelt wouldn't retract, the steering wheel was off center again, the grille fell off, and the fuse box door wouldn't stay closed. Meanwhile, the Acura Legend was Motor Trend's import car of the year for 1987. Admittedly though, by 1990, the interior build quality was vastly improved, but I think by then it was just too late. Everyone had already bought the Legend. And while the Legends were for the most part just returning to the dealer for oil changes, at 15,769 miles on the Sterling, the hood and trunk release got stuck, the passenger seatbelt wouldn't retract for a second time, the passenger lumbar support stopped working again, and the key and ignition chime stopped working. Rover would give up on their Sterling cars in the American market after 1991 for obvious reasons. Alright, at 17,565 miles, the sunroof wouldn't open again, the coolant gauge was faulty again, and the fuel gauge was faulty for a fifth time. Starting to understand why they switched gauge cluster suppliers. Alright, where was I? Austin Rover would give up on the North American market after 1991 for obvious reasons, and starting in 1992 in Britain, the Rover 800 series moved into its second generation. They did start using their own V6 at this time, although some models like the Rover 800 Coupe would actually continue using Honda's 2.7 liter as late as 1995. So there we go, 5 vehicles that are either Hondas in disguise or at least are rocking Honda powertrains. Now this is by no means an exhaustive list. I didn't even cover all of the Isuzu rebadges, and there are more Rovers we could cover as well, so let me know if you want to see those.
Our record of craftsmanship, quality, attention to detail, and quite frankly, pedigree will always stack the odds unfairly in our favor. But of course, I couldn't possibly comment.
At 24,508 miles, the sunroof, coolant gauge, and fuel gauge all broke again. Also, the ignition key got stuck and the ashtray wouldn't open.